I walked out of the banquet hall with my hands in my pockets and didn't look back. The valet parking attendant, a young man, maybe 19, wearing a vest 2 sizes too big, watched me come through the glass doors. I nodded at him. He nodded back. Neither of us said anything. I sat down on the low brick wall near the entrance, under a light that buzzed faintly in the cold November air, and I waited. I didn't know exactly what I was waiting for. I just knew I wasn't going back inside. My name is Martin. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer, raised one son, mostly on my own after my first wife passed, and remarried 11 years ago to a woman named Diane. I am not a man who makes scenes. I am not a man who raises his voice in public. I was taught that dignity is something you carry inside you. It doesn't require an audience, and it doesn't need to be announced. What happened inside that banquet hall, I will get to. But first, you need to understand a few things. My son Daniel is 33. He works in commercial insurance, lives about 40 minutes from me, and calls every Sunday around noon. He married a woman named Claire 3 years ago. Claire is quiet, careful, and kind in the way that doesn't advertise itself. I liked her from the first time I met her. She makes Daniel laugh, really laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine, and that told me everything I needed to know. They had a daughter 9 months after the wedding. Her name is Rose. She's 2 years old, and she calls me Pop Pop, which is the greatest title I've ever held in my life. Now, Diane and our marriage has been complicated. I want to be honest about that. She's not a villain in the simple story. She is a woman who came into this life with her own history, her own children from a previous marriage, and her own ideas about how a family should be organized. Her son Marcus is 38, her daughter Lydia is 35. They were already grown when Diane and I married, so there was no question of raising them. But there was always a question of where I stood with them, and where they stood with me. The answer, for the most part, was at a respectful distance. That was fine. I understood it. Blended families at this stage of life don't always blend. Sometimes they just coexist politely at holidays and agree not to poke at anything sharp. What I did not understand, and what took me longer than I am proud of to fully see, was the way Diane spoke about Daniel in front of her children. It wasn't cruel. It was something quieter than cruel and harder to name. It was a habit of smallness, a pattern of remarks that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. Daniel's job was fine, but not as impressive as Marcus's. Daniel's house was nice, but in a neighborhood that had a certain ceiling. Claire was sweet, but not really someone you'd have a deep conversation with. And when Rose was born, Diane held her for about 4 minutes at the hospital and said she looked like a healthy baby, and then handed her back to Claire and started talking about a remodeling project she was planning for the kitchen. I noticed. I stored it. I said nothing, which is its own kind of failure, and one I own completely. Now let me tell you about the retirement party. My former employer, Ackerman & Hall Engineering, hosted a dinner in my honor last April. 31 years. The partners reserved a private room at a restaurant called the Birchwood, a place with white tablecloths and a bar that glowed amber in the low light. My colleagues came, people I had worked beside for decades. My project manager from the early years, a man named Stuart who is now 70 and still talks about bridge load tolerances like they are the most interesting thing in the world. My assistant from the last 12 years, a woman named Patricia who gave a speech that made 2 people cry. My former supervisor, Gerald, who shook my hand and said, "You built things that will outlast both of us." And I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Daniel was there with Claire. Rose was the babysitter. Daniel wore a tie, which he almost never does, and Claire had pinned her hair up and looked lovely. They sat across from me, and Daniel kept catching my eye and smiling in the way that reminded me of when he was a boy, and proud of something but didn't want to say so directly. Diane sat beside me. Lydia and Marcus did not come. There had been a scheduling conflict, Diane explained. A prior commitment. I said I understood. I did understand. I had long since adjusted my expectations. The dinner was warm and long and filled with the particular joy of being seen by people who actually know your work. There were toasts. There was a framed photograph of a bridge I designed in 2003 that still spans a river in rural Pennsylvania. There was a card signed by 42 people. And then my colleagues presented me with a gift. It was a wooden box, handmade, about the size of a shoebox. One of the junior engineers had built it in his spare time. I found this out later. The lid had been laser engraved with a small topographic map of the first project I had ever led back in 1994. A flood control channel in western Ohio. Not glamorous work, functional, precise, important in ways that most people drive past without knowing. Inside the box were things my colleagues had contributed individually. A small compass I had once lent to a field team and apparently never got back, now returned with a note attached. A folded set of original hand drawings from a project in 2007 that almost didn't get built. A letter from the county engineer of a town in Indiana where we had designed a new water system, thanking us for the work. And at the bottom, a check, a generous check. Pooled contributions made out to a scholarship fund I had quietly established at my alma mater 3 years earlier for first-generation engineering students. I could not speak for a moment. I looked at that box. I looked at those people. I thought about 31 years of early mornings and flooded work sites and calculations done twice, and then done a third time to be certain. I thought about the bridge in Pennsylvania. I thought about the water system in Indiana and the people who turned on their taps and didn't have to think about what came out of them. I managed to say thank you. I meant it more than I have meant most things in my life. Diane leaned over and looked in the box. "A wooden box," she said. Her voice was light, conversational. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't whispering at all. "And some old papers," she said. "I thought they were going to give you a watch." The table went quiet. Not entirely. The room was still full of noise, other conversations, silverware on plates, but the people immediately around me went quiet. Stuart looked at his water glass. Patricia looked at the table. Gerald looked at Diane with an expression I won't try to describe. Daniel looked at me. I looked at Diane. She had already moved on. She had already moved on. She was reaching for her wine glass. She said something to the woman beside her about the restaurant's lighting being too dim. I sat with what had just happened for a long moment. I thought about whether I had misheard. I had not. I thought about whether she understood what was in the box. She had looked directly at the letter from Indiana and the folded drawings. She had seen the compass and the note attached to it. I set my napkin on the table, pushed my chair back, and excused myself quietly. I went to the men's room and ran cold water over my hands. I looked at myself in the mirror for a while. I thought about the bridge. I thought about 31 years. I thought about what it means to have your life's work described as a wooden box and some old papers by a person who has eaten at your table for 11 years. I dried my hands. I walked back out to the room. I did not sit back down at the main table. I sat down beside Daniel. He didn't say anything about what had happened. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly, the way men in our family do when words are not adequate. And then he told me about something funny. Rose had done that morning with a bowl of oatmeal. I laughed. It was real laughter. I stayed at Daniel's side for the rest of the evening. I want to stop here to tell you something about a man named Howard. Howard was my neighbor for about 6 years in the house I owned before I moved in with Diane. He was in his mid-70s when I met him, a retired postal worker, a widower, a man who spent his mornings on his front porch with coffee and his evenings in the garden with no particular urgency. He was not a man of great ambitions or notable accomplishments by any external measure. He had carried mail for 38 years. He had kept his yard. He had buried his wife and kept going. What I remember most about Howard is something he said to me once when I was going through a difficult period. This was during the early years after Daniel's mother died, when I was trying to hold everything together and not always succeeding. I was standing at the mailbox and he came over and we talked for a while, as we often did. He said, "The people who matter will see what you're carrying. You don't have to hold it up for them. They'll already see it." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. Howard passed away 4 years ago in the spring. I was a pallbearer. I was the only non-family member who was asked, and that meant something to me that I have never quite put into words. The drive home from the retirement dinner was quiet. Diane talked about the food, about someone's dress, about whether we should repaint the dining room before the holidays. I answered when spoken to. I kept my eyes on the road. There was a conversation waiting in that car that neither of us started, and we pulled into the driveway, went inside and went to bed. And it was still waiting. In the days that followed, I turned some things over in my mind. I thought about Howard's sentence. I thought about the people at that table who had gone quiet. I thought about 31 years and a wooden box with a topographic map on the lid. I thought about Daniel's hand on my shoulder. I thought about Rose calling me Pop Pop, and I started to understand something that I think I had been slowly understanding for a long time without wanting to name it. There is a difference between a marriage that has difficulties and a marriage that is built on a fundamental misalignment of values. Difficulties can be worked through. Misalignments are different. A misalignment means that the thing you love most in the world, the thing you would point to and say, "This is what I am, this is what I made with my life," is not something the other person can see or value or honor. It's not that they dislike it. It's that they look at it and see a wooden box and some old papers. I don't say this with bitterness. I want to be precise about that. I say it as a man who spent 11 years hoping that the distance between us was a distance that could be closed and who arrived eventually and quietly at the understanding that it could not. I made an appointment with an attorney in May, not to file anything immediately, to understand my situation, to know the landscape before I decided how to walk through it. I had built a life before Diane, and I had assets that were mine, and I had a son and a granddaughter who called me Pop Pop, and I wanted to be clear-eyed about what I was protecting and what I was walking away from and what the difference was. The attorney was a woman in her 50s named Sandra, referred to me by a colleague. She was direct and thorough and did not waste my time with sentiment. She told me what I needed to know. I left her office with a clear head. I want to tell you about a moment that happened in June, about 6 weeks after the retirement dinner. Daniel had invited me to Rose's second birthday party, a backyard gathering, casual, maybe 15 people, Claire's parents, a few young families from their neighborhood, Daniel's college roommate and his wife. I drove over on a Saturday afternoon with a gift and a card and a heart that was easier than it had been in months. Rose ran across the lawn toward me the moment she saw my car pull up. Pop, pop, pop. Pop, pop, pop. She ran with the particular full-body commitment of a 2-year-old who has not yet learned to hold anything back. Arms out, feet pounding the grass, and I crouched down and caught her, and she grabbed my face with both of her small hands and looked at me with complete seriousness and said, "Pop, Pop, there is cake," I said. "I heard there might be cake." She said, "It has flowers on it." I said, "That is very important information. Thank you for telling me." She accepted this and ran back toward the lawn, and I stood up and Daniel was standing there, watching, and he was smiling. I want to be clear about something. I did not stay in a difficult marriage for 11 years because I was weak. I stayed because I believed, genuinely, that things could be different, and because I do not give up easily on people or on commitments I have made. That is not weakness. That is stubbornness, which is its own kind of problem, and also, sometimes, a kind of integrity. But I will also say this. There is a point at which staying requires you to diminish something true about yourself in order to fit inside a space that was never actually built for you, and I had been bending myself into that space for a long time. I moved out in August. I rented a small house about 3 miles from Daniel and Claire. It has a yard. It has a porch. It has a second bedroom with a small bed and a shelf where I have been slowly assembling a collection of picture books. Diane did not see it coming. This is the thing I regret most. Not the decision, but the fact that I had gone so far inside myself in order to manage the daily reality of the marriage that I had stopped giving her any honest signal about where I was. She had no idea. When I sat down and told her, she was genuinely shocked, and her shock was real, and it was painful to see. I don't think I handled that well. I think I owed her more honesty earlier, and I did not give it to her. That is mine to carry. What happened next was not what I expected. About a week after I moved out, I received a phone call from Marcus, Diane's son. I had perhaps spoken to Marcus one-on-one a total of 4 or 5 times in 11 years, and I did not expect to hear from him. He was not calling to argue. He was not calling to take sides. He said he had been thinking about something for a while, and that he wanted me to know it, and that he hoped I would hear it in the spirit it was intended. He said that when his father had left, Diane's first husband, who had walked out when Marcus was 12 and Lydia was 9, his mother had changed in ways that she had never fully recovered from. She had built walls, he said, very high walls, and she had put the people she loved inside them and the people she didn't know well on the outside, and she had never quite learned to tell the difference between safety and distance. He said, "She's not a bad person. She just doesn't know how to let someone in without it eventually scaring her." I listened. He said he was sorry about the retirement dinner. He had heard about it from Daniel, whom he had apparently run into somewhere. He said what she said was not right and that he had told her so. I thanked him somber. I meant it. We spoke for about 20 minutes. At the end of the call, he said, "I think my father leaving the way he did broke something in her that she spent 30 years trying to fix by controlling everything she could. I don't think she even knows she does it." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. I thought about Diane at 28 years old, with 2 young children and a husband who had simply stopped coming home. I thought about what that does to a person. I thought about the walls Marcus described and about how, from the inside of a wall, it can feel like protection, when from the outside it looks like exclusion. I did not stop the divorce proceedings, but I made my peace with something. I am 64 years old. I have built bridges and water systems and drainage channels that will outlive me. I have a son who calls every Sunday and a granddaughter who runs at me full speed across the grass because she has not yet learned to hold herself back. I have a porch with a view of a maple tree that turns a color in October that I have no adequate word for. I have a shelf of picture books in a small room with a small bed waiting. There is a man I used to know named Howard who told me that the people who matter will see what you're carrying. I have come to believe that this is true, and that the corollary is also true, that the people who cannot see it are not bad people necessarily, but that you cannot make a life in the blind spot of someone who loves you, but cannot see you. You can try. You can try for 11 years, but eventually you have to stop bending and start standing. The morning I carried the last box into the rental house, Daniel came to help. We didn't talk much. We carried things. We put furniture where it seemed to belong. He assembled a bookshelf that came in pieces and required more patience than either of us had, and we argued mildly about whether the instructions were in the correct order. And eventually the shelf stood and we looked at it with the particular satisfaction of 2 men who have built a small thing. Then he drove to a diner nearby and came back with 2 coffees and a bag of food, and we sat on the porch, and it was a Tuesday morning in August, and the light was the particular gold of late summer, and we drank our coffee and didn't say much, and it was enough. More than enough. The wooden box from the retirement party is on my desk in the rental house. I open it sometimes. I look at the letter from Indiana and the compass and the folded drawings. I look at the topographic map on the lid, the lines tracing the shape of a piece of ground where I did my first real work, 30 years ago. A project that most people have never heard of and never will. It held water. It worked. It is still there. That is enough. That has always been enough. That has always been enough. I just needed to find my way back to knowing it. I have thought a lot about what it actually means to live with integrity. Not the word, but the practice of it. The daily, unglamorous work of it. Integrity is not something you perform for an audience. It is something you maintain in the small moments when no one is watching and when the cost of abandoning it would be entirely invisible to everyone except yourself. I know this because I spent 11 years testing the outer edges of that idea, bending to accommodate a dynamic that required me to be smaller than I was, and I know now that every time I bent without speaking, I made the next bend easier and the one after that easier still. That is how it works. Not in dramatic collapses, but in gradual erosions, one silence at a time. What I chose to do, not dramatically, not in anger, but with a clear head and a steady hand, was simply to stop eroding. The cause and the consequence were not separated by any mystery. I had stayed inside a situation that did not honor what I had built or who I was, and the consequence was that I was slowly disappearing inside it. When I finally stopped, when I sat with an attorney on a Tuesday morning and spoke plainly about what I needed and what I was no longer willing to accept, the consequence of that was also not mysterious. Things became clear, not easy. Clear. There is a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with education or professional accomplishment. It is the intelligence of self-knowledge, understanding what you actually value, distinguishing it from what you have been told to value, and being willing to live by the difference. I did not always have that intelligence. I had to earn it slowly, through years of watching what happened when I ignored my own judgment. Every time I overrode what I knew to be true about my situation and told myself it would improve, I was choosing comfort over honesty. And comfort over honesty is a trade that always costs more than it pays. The courage I needed was not the dramatic kind. It was not a confrontation or a declaration. It was the quieter, harder kind. The courage to act on what I already knew without waiting for permission or for circumstances to force my hand. No one was going to rescue me from my own inertia. That was my responsibility. And when I finally accepted it, I found that I had been more capable of it than I had given myself credit for. What I know now, at 64, standing on the porch of a small rented house with a maple tree in the yard and a shelf of picture books waiting in a back room, is this. The life that fits you is not the life that requires the least conflict to maintain. It is the life in which the things you love most are visible and honored and real. I had a box on my desk with a topographic map on the lid and a letter from Indiana inside it, and I had a son who drove over on a Tuesday to carry boxes and argue about shelf assembly instructions, and I had a granddaughter who ran at me with everything she had. That was always the life. I just had to be honest enough to live in it.